Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gina Bryant, and I am the webinar facilitator today. Today's webinar, Can Your Company Require the COVID-19 Vaccine?, is brought to you by Corp Magazine in partnership with Kerr Russell, Mish Business, and the best and brightest companies to work for. Before I begin, I just have a few quick announcements. Today's broadcast is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit with SHRM and HRCI. In order to receive your credit, please fill out the survey that will be emailed to you this afternoon. Our broadcast today is being recorded, and we will include that in the email that you receive later today. If you have any questions or comments during this broadcast, please use the questions feature you see in the right-hand portion of your screen in your toolbar. We will have a quick question and answer session at the end of this webinar. If you would like a copy of the slides, you can retrieve them from your toolbar where it says handouts. Our presenter today is Olivia Hankinson. Olivia is an attorney in Kerr Russell's Labor and Employment Practice Group. She counsels and advises business owners, managers, and human resource professionals on various labor and employment related issues, including general litigation concerns, drafting agreements and policies, and representing such individuals in various agency hearings. Thank you all for joining us today. I would now like to turn this over to our presenter, attorney Olivia Hankinson. Go ahead, Olivia.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm excited to be here with everyone today, albeit remotely, and to speak with you about a topic that is at the forefront of the minds of many employers. As indicated, I will leave some time at the end of this presentation to take and answer some of your questions. But if there are any questions that you have which do not get addressed, or if over the course of the next several weeks and months, you have additional questions which arise, and I'm sure they will as new information comes out, then I encourage you to reach out to me with your questions. My information is on the last slide of the PowerPoint that you see before you. Before I get started, I do want to mention that just like everything else associated with COVID-19, so the mask mandates, remote work requirements, stay-at-home orders, etc., the information provided to you today is subject to change based on additional guidance from public health authorities, from state and local governmental authorities, and even developing case law. I know we are coming up on what feels like a decade, but is actually just closer to a year of this pandemic, and that HR professionals, managers, and employers have been consistently and constantly staying up to date on CDC guidance, MIOSHA updates, executive orders, now MDHHS orders, and I know that it can feel exhausting and even sometimes overwhelming, but I want to encourage you to keep that up and continue to monitor guidance from all sources so that you can modify and or change any policies as needed to ensure the safety of your workforces, your clients, and your visitors. So with that being said, let's get started on the pressing questions that are surrounding COVID-19 vaccines. So first, the biggest question is, can employers require their employees to be vaccinated? Although there are no federal or state laws specifically addressing whether or not employers may mandate COVID-19 vaccinations for their employees right now, the short answer to this question currently appears to be yes. Most employers will be able to require most employees to be vaccinated. However, there are some important caveats to this, which I will cover shortly. In anticipation of this question, and when considering that vaccines would become widely available to the public in 2021, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, has released some guidance, and that guidance is linked on the slide showing before you. So this guidance specifically addresses that employers will be able to require their employees to be vaccinated, and it further indicates that there will be some situations in which employers can exclude unvaccinated employees from their facility. Of course, Excluding individuals is a pretty drastic step, and there are several measures employers will need to abide by before taking this route. If you do find yourself in a position in which you think an unvaccinated individual is posing a threat to your workplace by nature of their unvaccinated status, then I would strongly advise you to reach out to an attorney to ensure that you have exhausted all of your legal obligations prior to removing or terminating that individual, as there are various protections contained in anti-discrimination statutes like Title VII and the Americans with Disabilities Act for employees who may not be able to obtain the vaccine based on medical conditions or religious objections. I will address the possible and likely employee objections to vaccines in a few slides, but before we get into that, let's take a step back and consider, as an employer, what are some of the things you want to consider when deciding whether or not to mandate, incentivize, or just encourage your employees to get vaccines. First of all, I encourage each of you to take an individualized assessment of your workforce. Is there a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of an individual or others if your employees are not vaccinated? This is the standard that is adopted by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. This act does allow employers to adopt standards to ensure that employees do not pose a direct threat to the health or safety of those in the workplace. So relying on this standard, the EEOC has concluded that the COVID-19 pandemic meets the direct threat standard, which is how employers have been able to conduct various other safety measures throughout the pandemic. So that would be your daily screenings, your temperature checks, etc. But employers should still consider their own workforces when determining whether to implement a vaccination policy. So if you have a workforce which is entirely remote and is able to remain entirely remote for the foreseeable future, then your employees will probably not pose a direct threat to their coworkers, and you should hold off on implementing a mandatory policy until that time in which it is necessary for your workers to return to in-person work. If, on the other hand, your workforce is split between employees who are required to perform in-person services and those who are and can continue to work remotely, then you may wish to consider limiting your vaccine mandate to those employees who are currently reporting for in-person work, because those employees are the most at risk for obtaining COVID-19 at the workplace. So you can implement policies based on whether or not your employees are actually performing in-person services. As a very brief aside, if your workforce is unionized, then there are other considerations that you will need to keep in mind when making the decision whether to require vaccination of your employees or not. Imposing a mandatory vaccination policy is likely a mandatory subject of bargaining, so you will probably have to address implementation of such a policy with the union. Previously, the National Labor Relations Board has determined that an implementation of similar types of protective measures, including mandatory flu vaccinations, are mandatory subjects of bargaining. So employers should be prepared on that ground if you do have a unionized workforce. You should also review your collective bargaining agreement to determine whether or not there is any specific provision or policy which addresses implementing mandatory vaccinations. If there's not a specific policy or provision in the CBA, then you should continue to review it for a management rights clause or another type of provision which grants an employer authority to unilaterally adopt reasonable workplace policies. If neither of those are present, then that's when you would likely need to address and bargain over the subject of vaccines with the union. Before engaging in bargaining, you should consider the details surrounding vaccinations. So where will employees obtain the vaccine? Who will schedule the vaccinations? Will you choose to impose a deadline for obtaining the vaccine? Who's going to pay the cost for the vaccines and for the missing work time, etc.? As these types of questions will need to be addressed with the union. I would again encourage employers to speak with Labor Counsel if you do have any questions regarding this, and in order for your counsel to conduct a complete review of the applicable CBA and your bargaining obligations. Even for those of you who do not have unionized workforces, the National Labor Relations Act will still protect your employees' concerted activities for the purposes of collective bargaining. So what that means is that if your employees come together to protest against a mandatory vaccine policy, if they organize a social media campaign, etc., then it's likely to be a protected activity. So make sure that you're speaking with a labor attorney prior to taking any form of adverse action against such employees, because an adverse action against them could result in an unfair labor practice charge against the employer. So after you conduct an assessment of your workplace and determine that some or all of your employees need to be vaccinated in order to prevent a direct threat to the workplace, then you still have some options to consider regarding vaccines. Namely, how do you want to implement a policy? Do you want to adopt a voluntary policy in which you strongly encourage but do not outright require your employees to be vaccinated? Do you wish to provide incentives for employees who are vaccinated? Or do you think it is absolutely necessary to adopt a mandatory policy in which all employees are required to be vaccinated prior to performing in-person services? I would love to be able to tell you guys that this is a super easy question and that there's a one-size-fits-all workplaces solution, but there really isn't. This is going to be a highly fact-dependent inquiry based on your specific workforces and your specific employees. So looking first at voluntary vaccination policies, this might be a good starting point for many employers, as some of you may have workforces who will readily volunteer to be vaccinated. With vaccines being so new, many of your employees may be hesitant to obtain the vaccine at this time. So implementing a voluntary policy rather than a mandatory one may be better for employee morale. Voluntary vaccine policies are also likely to be less of an administrative burden on employers, as you will not need to be processing disability and/or religious exemption requests from employees. So on background, employers would likely have less ADA and Title VII liability concerns resulting directly from their vaccine policy. However, as with anything, there are several downsides to consider as well. A voluntary program may not encourage very many of your employees to actually obtain the COVID-19 vaccine. So you could end up in a position where you have a mostly unvaccinated workforce. This could lead to a higher number of absences due to COVID-19, or it could also potentially lead to claims of an unsafe working environment. Even with a voluntary vaccine policy, though, the employer should still provide employees with resources on where to obtain the vaccine, and employers should be working with their employees to schedule the best time to obtain the vaccine if they choose to obtain one. To further encourage your employees, an employer can offer to pay for the cost of the vaccine if it is not otherwise covered, and/or the employer can offer to allow employees to take a whole or a partial paid day to obtain the vaccine and allow time to recover from any potential side effects that the vaccine may cause. Employers may also wish to consider developing vaccine educational campaigns to better educate their workforce on the benefits of obtaining a COVID vaccine. The CDC has very helpful information in explaining some of the specific details of the COVID-19 vaccine, which may be beneficial to your employees who are hesitant to obtain the vaccine due to not knowing very much about it at this time. Employers, if the employer wants to take it a step further than a merely voluntary policy, because you're not confident that implementing a voluntary policy would be sufficient on its own, then you may wish to consider offering some type of financial incentive to employees who do obtain the vaccine. For example, many companies are currently offering additional pay or compensation to employees who choose to be vaccinated. With this route, employers do have a variety of options if they choose to incentivize their employees, but primarily we are seeing companies choosing to provide employees with one-time additional pay, a one-time bonus, or offering an additional day or maybe multiple days of PTO or vacation leave to employees who do obtain the COVID-19 vaccine. One of the major benefits of an incentivized vaccine policy is that it may encourage more employees to obtain the vaccine than who would have otherwise. So therefore, it could provide a safer working environment for your workforce. This could lead to less risk of having a claim filed against your company for failure to maintain a safe working environment, and it could also reduce the number of your employees who will need to miss work due to becoming ill with COVID-19. However, incentivized vaccine policies are more administratively cumbersome than voluntary programs. So there is a bit more work with implementing and maintaining them. Another consideration for employers to keep in mind is that if your company begins with a voluntary program and then transitions into an incentivized program, you may need to retroactively provide the same benefits to the employees who originally received the COVID-19 vaccines during the voluntary program time period. And although this is likely to encourage more employees to obtain the vaccine than would if the policy was merely voluntary, it is still not likely to persuade your entire workforce to obtain the vaccine. So that's where a mandatory policy comes into place, as it is likely the most efficient route to ensure that the highest number of employees obtain the vaccine. So as previously mentioned, and once the vaccine is widely available, an employer can implement a mandatory vaccine policy, which would require all employees to be vaccinated prior to performing in-person services. Before implementing such a policy, I encourage you to carefully consider your workforce and evaluate the impact that a mandatory policy would have. Consider whether your employees are likely to view your company negatively, or if they will be generally dissatisfied with a mandatory policy. Also, keep in mind that even with a mandatory policy, there will still be exemptions available to employees who cannot get the vaccine due to either a medical condition, disability, or due to a sincerely held religious belief. So accordingly, prior to implementing a mandatory policy, an employer must make sure that it has the proper resources available to process and to respond to such objections from employees. Regardless of the type of policy you ultimately choose to implement, whether voluntary, mandatory, or incentivized, it is advisable to create a written vaccination policy to provide to your employees. This way, you're able to ensure that your policy is being applied in a uniform and non-discriminatory manner. Your written policy should address the specifics of the resources available to employees regarding where they can obtain vaccines, how an employee should plan to schedule their vaccination, who will bear the cost of paying for such vaccines, and any benefits or incentives provided to employees, along with what documentation should be provided to the company after the employee receives the vaccines, any deadlines for obtaining the vaccine, And you should also provide avenues for your employees with disabilities and/or religious exemptions to object to any mandatory vaccine policy. So another item which should be included in your written vaccine policy are the fact sheets, which are provided by the manufacturers of the vaccine and are available on the FDA website. Currently, in the US, there are 2 vaccines which have been authorized for use by the FDA, the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. It's important to note that these vaccines have not yet been approved by the FDA, but rather they have been authorized pursuant to what is known as an EUA, or an emergency use authorization. An emergency use authorization is designed for medical emergencies like a pandemic. It allows the FDA to authorize the use of unapproved products when certain criteria have been met. Vaccines that are authorized under an EUA are still rigorously tested prior to authorization, although the FDA provides that COVID-19 vaccines have been developed so quickly due to several factors, including coalescing government agencies, international counterparts, academia, nonprofit organizations, and pharmaceutical companies in order to develop a coordinated strategy for prioritizing development. The FDA still guarantees that the scientific standards, the integrity of the vaccine review process, and all other safety measures have been followed and they have not been sacrificed, even though it has been developed more quickly than we see from other vaccines. When an EUA is requested, the vaccine manufacturer will submit the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 data for review by the FDA. The FDA evaluates the manufacturing and controls information for the vaccine as well. So they look at the records, they conduct site visits, and they will review a company's previous compliance history in order to ensure that good manufacturing practices are being followed by the company who is requesting the EUA. So after an EUA is submitted and received, FDA scientists and physicians review the information in order to determine whether an EUA is appropriate. A public meeting of the Vaccines and Biological Products Advisory Committee is also held during this process. That committee is composed of non-FDA experts throughout the country. Those experts are screened prior to the meeting for potential conflicts of interest. During that meeting, the safety and effectiveness of the provided data is discussed so that the public and the scientific community has a clear understanding of the data and information that the FDA is evaluating. After that public meeting, the FDA will take into consideration the recommendations of this committee and they continue their evaluation of the EUA submission. It's important to realize that the data provided to the FDA for the emergency use authorization does not end with that initial submission. Rather, the manufacturers must include plans for active follow-up information to be provided to the FDA, including data on deaths, hospitalizations, and other serious or clinically significant adverse events among those individuals who receive the vaccine under the EUA. And this is to inform ongoing benefit risk determinations to support the continuation of the EUA. This post-authorization monitoring is not solely left to the FDA. At that point, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, also share the responsibility for safety monitoring, along with other areas who are involved in healthcare delivery. However, the ongoing assessment of the safety and benefits of the product can lead to a revocation of an emergency use authorization. An EUA revocation may occur when the statutory criteria for the authorization are no longer met. And revocation is something that employers will want to make sure they remain aware of, as a revocation of the EUA would mean that employers likely need to modify their own vaccination policies. So turning back to your actual written vaccination policy, because the vaccines are currently authorized pursuant to an EUA, the FDA does have an obligation to provide recipients of the vaccine with various information regarding the vaccine, including the potential benefits and the potential risks. The FDA currently has 2 posted fact sheets available on their website, one for the Pfizer vaccine and one for the Moderna vaccine. These sheets should be made available to the recipients of vaccines by healthcare professionals when they go in to obtain the vaccine. But due to the nature of the situation, it's advisable for employers to go ahead and to disclose these fact sheets and include an attachment to them within their written vaccination policy. On the slide you see before you, I have attached links to both of the current fact sheets as well as the FDA website, but please continue to monitor the website for any updates. On the FDA website, you can also find more information regarding EUAs and the process to obtain and keep an EUA, which may be beneficial information to provide to your employees as well. So the reason that we want to make sure that our employees are looking at the fact sheet is because it does include information about who should not receive the vaccine. So primarily if you're allergic to any ingredient in the vaccine, but it also provides a list of possible side effects of the vaccine so that your employees are anticipating that and they can be prepared for certain side effects like injection site tenderness, muscle aches, headaches, etc. So a big question that arises about EUAs is whether this impacts any statement by the EEOC which allows employers to mandate vaccines. At this time and with the information available, it does not. The EEOC explicitly references EUA vaccines and still concludes that employers may require vaccinations when they are widely available. But as with most new policies and procedures, we do anticipate that there will be litigation which arises as a result of such policies. As I stated, the EEOC has made it clear in their guidance that employers can require employees to obtain the COVID vaccine. But this is just guidance and it is subject to further change, and you should continue to monitor not only that guidance, but also the developing case law to determine if any changes or alterations are needed to your policies. In the meantime, though, to best ensure that you are abiding by all legal obligations if you adopt a mandatory policy, I want you to be aware of how to react and respond to employees who express objections to the vaccine based on either a disability or a religious belief. So let's discuss what an employer should do if an employee comes forward and asserts that they cannot obtain a COVID vaccine due to a disability or a medical condition. The ADA provides some very specific information regarding the process which should be followed in case of a requested disability accommodation. So many of you will already be familiar with this process and able to easily implement it. When an employee claims an exemption based on a medical condition or a disability, the company needs to engage in what is called the interactive process with the employee to ascertain whether or not a reasonable accommodation is appropriate. A reasonable accommodation is an accommodation that does not result in undue hardship to the employer. In the context of the ADA, an undue hardship means a significant expense or difficulty. Just as with any other interactive process, the company is entitled to make reasonable documentation requests of the employee. So when the disability and or the need for accommodation is not obvious, then the employer may ask the individual to provide documentation about his or her disability and the functional limitations. That's generally going to be a doctor's note. Once you have that documentation, then you can proceed with the interactive process in which you need to determine whether there is a reasonable accommodation available for this employee. So we go back to that direct threat language, which is on the screen before you. And our inquiry becomes, what accommodation that is reasonable can we provide to this employee in order to reduce the direct threat to an acceptable level? This, again, is going to depend on your workforces. For healthcare facilities interacting with patients, or even with facilities with frequent public engagement, it's going to be more difficult for you to reduce the direct threat than it will be for a smaller office with employees who can remain 6 feet away from others at all times. Some possible accommodations to consider may be to continue allowing unvaccinated employees to work remotely, if that's something that's feasible and efficient for your company. You can also consider relocating an employee's work site to a location in which the employee can remain more remote and socially distanced from others. Or you can continue to have the unvaccinated individual undergo daily screenings, ensure that they are wearing a mask at all times, and ask them to maintain social distancing requirements, even if those requirements are later discontinued for your other vaccinated employees. And this raises another important point. For the time being, after your employees are vaccinated and until the CDC and DHHS, MIOSHA, or some other governmental authority advises as such, employers should continue to require their employees to follow the same safety measures that are or should be currently in place at your facility. So you need to continue to have even your vaccinated employees wear masks, continue to have them remain 6 feet away from each other, continue the frequent and CDC compliant cleanings, etc. I know we are, of course, all hopeful that we will be able to eventually stop requiring these additional safety measures. But until that time, we need to ensure compliance with those safety measures to make sure that we're abiding by our legal requirements and also to make sure that our workforces are as safe as possible. So going back to our employee who cannot be vaccinated due to a disability, if you determine that there is no way to eliminate or reduce the direct threat to an acceptable level without the vaccine, then the EEOC has provided that employees may be able to be excluded from your facility. At this point, you will want to consider, you will want to consider if the employee is entitled to other types of leave under existing employer policies, if they're entitled to leave under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or if they're entitled to FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act leave. At this point, and even during the reasonable accommodation stage, it's always advisable to reach out to an attorney to make sure that the proper steps are being followed and that you are maintaining compliance with the ADA at all times. Now, in addition to employees who may have medical conditions preventing them from obtaining the COVID-19 vaccine, you may also have employees who have religious objections to obtaining the vaccine. When you have an employee who comes forward and asserts a sincerely held religious belief, which precludes them from obtaining a vaccine, then it's going to be a similar type of process as how you would respond to a disability accommodation request. These two accommodations will be governed by different statutes, disability under the ADA and religious accommodation under Title VII, but generally employer responses will be similar. So again, we want to consider whether there is a reasonable accommodation available to this employee. A reasonable accommodation is again one that does not pose an undue burden or hardship on the employer. But there is a difference between Title VII and the ADA here. In the context of Title VII, an undue burden means more than a de minimis cost or burden on the employer. So this is a more employer lenient standard than the ADA is. With that being said, employers should still consider the same types of reasonable accommodations. So can this employee work remotely? Can they be relocated to a different office to socially distance, etc.? If there is no accommodation available, then just like with the disability accommodations, the EEOC has provided that employers may be able to exclude the individual from their facilities. Again, this is where you want to loop in legal counsel if you haven't done so already, so they can evaluate your existing policies. Something that I think a lot of employers may begin to question is the sincerity of these religious beliefs. The EEOC does provide that since the definition of religion is so broad and because it protects beliefs, practices, and observances with which an employer may be unfamiliar, the employer should ordinarily assume that an employee's request for religious accommodation is based on a sincerely held belief. But if an employer has an objective basis for questioning either the religious nature or the sincerity of that belief, practice, or observance, then the employer would be justified in requesting additional supporting information. The supporting information does not need to come from a church official or even a church member, but instead could come from others who are aware and have knowledge about the practice or belief. This could include written materials describing the belief or practice, the employee's own firsthand explanation, witness statements from those who have been identified to have knowledge about the belief or practice, etc. So it is quite broad. So we've addressed the potential ADA and Title VII obligations that employers need to abide by to best protect themselves in the event of employment discrimination litigation arising from a vaccine policy. But a lot of employers are also asking about what types of liability exposure may result if an employee has an adverse reaction to the vaccine. As a general disclaimer, there is not an established body of case law or other definitive legal guidance addressing this issue yet. And although courts have considered this in other contexts, it is subject to change based on the developing case law, which will result through litigation, which could take some time. With that being said, generally, we anticipate that under most state laws, adverse reactions which are had by employees due to a vaccine obtained pursuant to a mandatory vaccination policy will likely be covered by workers' compensation. The legal community tends to think that not only because an adverse reaction would likely be deemed a workplace injury if it stemmed from a mandatory policy, but also because that's how courts have decided mandatory vaccination policies in the past. So prior adverse reactions to Hep B vaccines, flu vaccines, etc., have resulted in workers' compensation claims. The Michigan Workers' Disability Compensation Act provides what is known as an exclusive remedy for work-related personal injuries or occupational diseases. This means that an injured employee cannot sue his or her employer for a claim that is already covered by workers' compensation. There are some exceptions for limited circumstances, such as when the injury was intended by the employer, and this is very unlikely in the context of mandatory COVID vaccines. I do want to briefly mention that early on, there were some state legislators who pushed to implement laws and regulations which would have banned or limited employers from mandating vaccines for their employees. But these suggestions did not gain much support, and they have not been enacted in any state to my knowledge. Still, this is an important reason why employers have to keep apprised of all changes, because new legislation could be adopted which changes your existing legal duties and obligations. On that same note, if an employer requires vaccines and an employee sustains an adverse reaction, that will likely turn into a workers' comp claim, depending on the development of additional case law and other guidance. But another question is there any liability risk for an employer who chooses not to have their employees vaccinated? As of right now, there is probably not a large liability risk if an employer chooses not to implement a policy. There are no current laws requiring Michigan employers to implement a mandatory vaccination program. And additionally, the Michigan legislature has enacted legislation providing liability protection for employers who operate in compliance with all federal, state, and local statutes, rules, regulations, and orders. So as long as there are no orders, rules, regulations, etc., requiring or advising employers to vaccinate employees, and as long as you continue to abide by all existing COVID-19 related statutes and rules, then you likely will not be liable for an employee's exposure to COVID-19. But again, it means that this is essential for employers to continue monitoring. Particularly, keep a close watch for any guidance that is released by Michigan's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or MIOSHA. If there were to be a claim for an employer's failure to require vaccines, then it would likely be a claim asserted under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, alleging a failure to provide a safe working environment. So please keep an eye on MIOSHA guidance to see if there are any additional recommendations related to vaccines. And if you haven't reviewed or updated your COVID-19 response plan lately, it might be a good time for you to review the MIOSHA emergency rules and ensure that your plan is in compliance with those, along with the recently enacted Michigan legislation, which is 2020 Public Act 238. Along with other CDC recommendations. By continuing to operate in compliance with federal, state, and local statutes, rules, regulations, and orders, employers should not face any enhanced exposure to liability claims asserted by visitors, even if they presently do not mandate employee vaccinations. So at this point, that covers the basic overview of information that employers should be aware of and should consider when they're determining what, if any, type of vaccination policy to implement in their facilities. I do want to open this up and try to answer any questions that you may have. So if you have questions, please submit those if you haven't already. If any of you have specific questions about your particular workforces or questions about drafting policies for your workplace, you can reach out to me after this webinar at the contact information on the slide in front of you. My phone number and email address are obviously on there. So even if you have questions in the upcoming months as vaccines do become readily available to the general public, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. There will be a lot of changes, and I do want to make sure everyone is prepared as possible to respond to any such changes. In the meantime, and while you guys are submitting questions, I do want to cover a few questions that I have been hearing frequently from employers, starting with, can I require my employee to provide documentation to show that they have received a COVID-19 vaccine? The answer is yes. Often asking to see medical documentation is considered a disability-related inquiry under the ADA, so it is precluded in many situations. But in this case, the EEOC has determined that an employer's request to show proof of receipt of a COVID-19 vaccine is not likely to elicit information about a disability and therefore is not a disability-related inquiry. So you can ask for documentation. You do want to make sure, though, that you're not asking any subsequent questions after you receive that documentation, as you might move into the realm of disability-related inquiries. So don't ask why an individual did not receive a vaccination, because this could elicit information about a disability. If you're requiring your employees to provide proof that they have received a COVID-19 vaccine from a pharmacy or from their own healthcare provider, then you may want to warn the employee not to provide any additional medical information in order to avoid implicating the ADA. This is something that can be placed in your written policy, which leads us into the question of, should an employer implement a written policy? Yes, you should. We've already gone over some of the benefits of a written policy. It makes administration easier. It ensures uniform application. It provides your employees with avenues to object to vaccines, etc. So having a written policy in place is a great way for you to be able to lay out your expectations and requirements of your employees so they know exactly how to proceed. We're also seeing a lot of employers ask about incentivizing vaccines, and as indicated earlier, there are various ways an employer can provide incentives to employees. Again, though, you want to ensure that your policy is clear and established so that you're implementing it in a non-discriminatory manner and complying with all applicable laws. On the lower end of incentivized policies is providing a partial or entire day off for employees who are obtaining the COVID-19 vaccine, but you can also provide additional compensation to employees directly, or you can provide additional PTO to be used by the employee at any time in compliance with your existing PTO scheduling policies. Another question that employers are worried about is payment. Who pays for the vaccine? If you're mandating the vaccine for your employees, then you should be paying for the vaccine. The Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, requires that employers reimburse employees for expenses incurred on the employer's behalf. So if you have a voluntary program, then this might not be necessary, but you may wish to consider doing so in order to encourage more employees to obtain the vaccine. Employers across the nation and across Michigan are likely going to take different approaches to vaccine policy implementation, depending on their industries, their workforce sizes, and other considerations. So for the most part, we're seeing a lot of employers adopt either voluntary or incentivized vaccine policies right now. And this is for several reasons. One of which is that due to the undeveloped case law in the area, while we can opine on liability exposure, there are still outstanding questions which remain. In addition to potential litigation and liability concerns, recent studies are still showing that about 30 to 40% of Americans would either probably or definitely not get a vaccine, and that's something that employers want to take into consideration as well. It can sometimes be difficult to find a balance between keeping your workers satisfied and also making sure they are protected as best they can be. So that's why introducing educational programs about the vaccine could help ease this divide and inform your employees about the benefits of vaccinations. There are many resources out there to help with this type of program. The CDC is a great place to start, as it has plenty of information addressing specific questions about the vaccine, so about herd immunity, precautions to take after receiving the vaccine, and whether or not you can obtain the vaccine in conjunction with other vaccines. Another reason employers are holding off right now is because, of course, the vaccine is not available to the general public. Until that time, employers cannot and should not be implementing mandatory vaccine policies because many of their employees will not have access to the vaccines. Even when the vaccines begin to become widely available, there may still be some scheduling concerns and availability limitations. So these are all things to consider when implementing a policy. Finally, I do want to briefly address COVID-19 vaccine liability waivers. I would advise employers not to rely very heavily on these liability waivers for COVID-19 vaccines. There are a host of concerns with employer liability waivers generally, including public policy concerns with the inherent power dynamic that's present in an employer-employee relationship. So there's a decent chance that waivers of this nature would not be enforceable at all. Employers should, though, make sure that their employees are aware of the potential risks and effects of the COVID-19 vaccine, which is why we do recommend providing the fact sheets for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, along with any other vaccine that may come out and be authorized in the future, so that your employee can review them and make sure that they don't have any existing allergies to any of the ingredients, etc. So I will open it up to other questions now, if there are any.
Hi, Olivia, this is Rebecca. We do have a few questions. One is, what happens when a policy is implemented and the vaccine is not available in certain geographic areas to assure employees can participate?
Right, that's a great question. So we do want to hold off on implementing any mandatory or even incentivized vaccine policy while the vaccines are not widely available to the public in the area in which your company is located. So until that time, you may just want to sit back and consider the implications of vaccination policies and begin to formulate which type of policy you want to go with, whether voluntary, mandatory, or incentivized. But again, until vaccines are widely available to all of your employees, you should not be implementing those mandatory policies.
Thank you. And another question was, we just received our CLIA waiver. We are looking to start testing our employees using the Binox COVID-19 rapid response cards. Can we make these tests mandatory as part of their job duties and functions?
I will say that that is not something that I feel comfortable answering at this time due to just the lack of knowledge about those specific types of waivers. If whoever asked the question wants to reach out to me and we can chat about the more specifics of your workforce, then I welcome you to do so, but I would need more information before responding.
Okay. Do I need a written policy if we only encourage employees to get the vaccine and offer an incentive to get the vaccine?
I would encourage you to, yes, adopt a written vaccination policy regardless of the route that you are taking. Even if you're just encouraging your employees to receive a vaccine, it's helpful to provide resources indicating where they can go and how scheduling will be handled. Also, with incentivized policies specifically, you want to make sure that you are laying out all of the incentives that are being offered so that you can ensure that the policy is applied in a non-discriminatory and uniform manner.
Okay. How do incentives?
I'm sorry, real quick. This is Gina. Sorry, Olivia. Can you go back to your contact slide, people, for everyone to see? The contact slide?
Yes.
Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, here's another one. How do incentives work for those with a religious accommodation or disability preventing vaccination? Is it discrimination that those people don't receive the incentives?
Likely not, but that is something that you will want to take into consideration when you are determining whether or not to offer an incentivized policy. So it's going to depend on your specific workforces. You'll want to take into consideration, of course, employee morale generally. Are your employees likely to get upset if other people are receiving incentives and they are not able to obtain the vaccine? There are various ways that you can try to work with those employees who are unable to be vaccinated. But something else that you want to consider with an incentivized policy is just the general impact that it will have on employee morale. So would your employees be even more wary of obtaining the vaccine if they think that they should only get it if an incentive is offered? Again, this is where it's going to be really important for employers to independently consider their individual workplaces and make this assessment.
Thanks, Olivia. And another one was if they start having a voluntary vaccine, policy for the vaccine, can they then move over later into a mandatory?
Yes, so if you want to start out with a lower level, either a voluntary policy or an incentivized policy, you can always increase your policy at a later time. So if you start with a voluntary vaccination policy and none of your employees are getting vaccinated, then you might need to consider implementing either an incentivized or a mandatory policy, and that is perfectly fine for you to do so at this point.
Great. Can you clarify whether the stipulations only apply if the employer is administering and offering the vaccine on site, or if it also applies if an employee is vaccinated off-site through insurance or government?
So what I have covered today is going to apply regardless to whether the employer is implementing the vaccines on site or if it's off site with mandatory policies. All of the accommodation requests will still be applicable even if your employees have to go off site to obtain the vaccination.
Thank you. One question here is, we are a healthcare provider. Can we be held liable for not having our employees vaccinated?
So for healthcare providers, medical practices generally, when you're conducting an evaluation of your workforce, the direct threat present from having unvaccinated employees in your workforce is higher than it would be for other types of workforces, which may not even have workers interacting with the public generally or even with each other. So that's something that you will want to consider when conducting that direct threat analysis. But at the current time, there are no legislation in Michigan or federally that is mandating you to require your employees to be vaccinated. So for right now, no, there would not be increased liability exposure for you. But again, that is very dependent upon changes to guidance, additional legislation which is enacted, and particularly I would advise you to monitor those MIOSHA updates for any changes in their guidance.
Great, and to be cognizant of time, we'll take just one more. Just want to confirm that social distancing and PPE, such as a mask, is considered an accommodation to someone who doesn't want the vaccine.
It could be, yes. So when you are when you're engaging in the interactive process, an interactive dialogue with an individual who cannot be vaccinated, you will want to consider whatever accommodations that are reasonable for you. So it might be something more significant than PPE and social distancing. So it might be, depending on your workforce, it could be remote requirements for that employee to continue to work remotely. You could move their office into a location in which they are able to socially distance more. But if that's not reasonable for your company, then it is possible that an accommodation could be for that unvaccinated individual to wear a mask at all times, to always maintain 6 feet of distance, to continue those daily screenings, etc.
Thanks, Olivia. Gina, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Rebecca.
course.
As a reminder, please fill out that survey that will be emailed to you later this afternoon. Again, it will be the only way you will be able to receive your continuing education credits for SHRM or HCRI if you need them. Today's webinar was recorded. We are going to email this to you later on this afternoon, and we'll include the PowerPoint presentation once again so that you can have the links that she has on there. Again, thank you, Olivia. Very good information today. I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Have a wonderful afternoon. Be safe and stay healthy, everyone.
Thank you.